Hi, everyone. This is Dallin Wortham, host of the Charter School Connection podcast. I'm really excited for today's guest, but before introducing our guest, let's just go ahead and thank our sponsor, Enrollio. Enrollio is an automated enrollment CRM lottery software that will just completely um, increase the speed that you're able to contact leads, students, applicants, families, make sure that they get automated emails and text messages, helping them through their enrollment flow. And it'll just help your front office not have to call and send out so many emails. So if you're interested in speeding up your enrollment process and increasing your conversion rate from website traffic to actual students in your seat, check out Enrollio. But without further ado, let's go ahead and welcome the guest for today, Anders Lindgren. He is the president and founder of School Ops, and he's has some really cool experiences working in the education field, but I'm not going to steal his thunder. So we'll let him kind of explain that. So welcome to the show, Anders.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I'm really excited to kind of dive into your story. You told me on a previous call a little bit about it, and I was really blown away. I thought, like, what? Who has that story? Who has to pick up and learn as quickly as Anders did? So if you could just kind of tell us how you got your start in education, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, well, as you alluded to, it's a bit of a whirlwind. And so essentially, right after graduating from college, I was part of this fellowship called the Venture for America Fellowship. And as part of that, I was on a school founding team in Baltimore. And, it's my first job out of college. I'd been like, a lifeguard prior to this, so did not have real work experience. And so they gave me a role that was something akin to like special assistant to the founder, right? I was kind of like, hey, you're kind of like, got a bunch of energy, you're 22, you're smart enough, like we'll throw you at some problems. This should be great. And so I was really excited just to learn more about schools and founding a new school and what this was all like. And then on the third day of my job, the person who was sort of our director of operations figure was like, hey, this is really stressful. I'm kind of done with this. Like, I'm out. Good luck. I actually remember asking him, I was like, hey, like, do you think we're going to be okay to open this school? Like, there are a lot of pieces that still need to be put together. And he was like, I don't know, man. Like, that really depends on how well you do your job. I'm 22 years old. So thus commences, like it was August at this point. So we had a month till school opened, a series of very high intensity 100-hour work weeks. We were able to open school. I ended up in the hospital the day before school started, just some stress related things. But we made it. I got back in there after some emergency surgery, and we were up and running and continued with, the 100-hour weeks for quite some time. But really, I was Googling everything from like, how do I buy healthcare for my employees? And like, what is a purchase order? How do you build a business line of credit? What is a good price for 100,000 rolls of toilet paper? How to remediate asbestos, right? Like, I knew nothing. And so I started to pick up a little bit of this and really also didn't know what it meant to be a director of operations. So my framework at the time was basically like, if it seems like a big problem and the principal and executive director are not currently tackling it, it's probably my job. And so I just did everything right that I thought needed to happen. And eventually I kind of popped my head up and said, all right, we're 6 months into this. We've still got some things that we need to figure out, but like the most out of control seeming fires have been sort of like brought into a reasonable scope. And let me like take a breath and say, how do I do this job?
Mm-hmm.
And so I looked around, right? And I was like, great, my principal, my teachers, I've seen them go through professional development, right? They go to sessions or get coaches or mentors. Like there's all these different systems for people on the academic side to learn how to excel in their roles. So like, great, I will just Google that and then I'll sign up for it and then I'll know how to do this job. And as you may have guessed, if you're in the operations world, right, that was not the case at all. I Googled it, nothing existed. There was no professional learning whatsoever. And thus commenced a 4-year tour of like going up and down the East Coast, taking the Amtrak to New York and DC, visiting really high performing schools, shadowing their directors of operations, taking notes on like what works, what doesn't, and just sort of like learning what this job is. And that's ultimately why I founded School Ops, to provide that kind of professional learning for everyone in a structured way.
That's insane. So before we continue on down this crazy whirlwind of a story, which man, that was jam-packed full of information. What was the name of the school that you helped start when you were 22?
It was called Baltimore Collegiate School for Boys. When we founded it, it was founded with grades 4 through 6, and grew to now it's grades 4 through 8. It's had years in which it was one of the highest performing schools in Baltimore, but has also had some years in which it wasn't. And we really founded it right to solve this problem, or solve, I guess, is too strong. It tried to contribute to a huge community network of organizations and people and activists trying to address the fact that in Baltimore City at that time, and I believe still, if you are a Black boy in the public education system, you're more likely over the course of your lifetime to be murdered than to receive a college degree. And so Baltimore is really just a place that stays in my heart because I loved my time there. And also there was such a sense as a community that we have an incredibly important mission and we all have to be 100% in because we need to be there for these kids.
Yeah. So, well, that's awesome that you're able to be a part of that experience and do that kind of work. But when I was 22, I was like just trying to go to my college classes and like not burn my corn dogs, my frozen corn dogs in the oven. Like just, and you were starting an entire school. So I'm just trying to think like what? I mean, I've heard this, it's not really a quote, I'm paraphrasing it, but pretty much someone said it's good to have naive optimism. I think it was Mark Rober, and where he was saying that it's almost better not to know a lot of things and get started on projects because you're open and you aren't set in your ways and you don't know how hard it is. So you just kind of go in with this optimism and then you figure out how hard it is. Then you look back and like, if I would have known how hard it was, I might not have even started. And I wouldn't have gotten to this rewarding point in my life. So I'm almost glad that I didn't know everything. Did, can you confirm that or deny that in any way? Was that at
Oh
all the
yeah.
story?
In fact, I remember really vividly when I interviewed for this job. It was a whirlwind of an interview. So I got to Baltimore. I drove there from Philly, where my family was, and I arrived at 9 a.m. So I was up at 6:30 to take that 2 hour drive. And I decided, hey, I'm going to stay in Baltimore that night, because I want to get to know the city, if this is where I'm going to live. So I sort of found a friend of a friend who was willing to let me crash on their couch. And there was no end time listed for the interview. So it's like, oh, I'll show up at 9. I don't know, maybe by noon I'll be done. And so I walk into the office and this guy's like working crazy hard. A million things are happening. He's like, hey, what do you think of these business cards? It's like, oh, I like them. Maybe you could tweak this. And he's like, great. And says to the assistant, like, all right, tweak that thing and then, send them off. I'm like, oh, great. I got to contribute to that. And
Mhm.
then we went to the physical school building, still not at all habitable already because I was interviewing. It was, before school opening was close at hand. And he was like, great, just look at each of the rooms and figure out what subject they should be. I was like, oh, you mean like, if like it's got a sink, it's probably a science. He was like, yeah, exactly. That's perfect. And gave me a bunch of note cards. And I wrote on the note cards like what the rooms should be. I thought it was just like an exercise to interview. But on my first day of working, and the note cards were still there, and like they had turned into those rooms. And so like it basically was an interview. It's like a free day of work.
Uh-huh.
And it goes until midnight. It's like we just keep going. We go down to DC, there's a panel, have dinner, like work out all the stuff for the school. And I keep texting this friend of a friend, like, hey man, I don't know if like I'm so sorry. Like, I don't even know you. I'm crashing your couch. Like, I'm not going to be in until really late. And then I finally get to their house. We go up, this guy's got a roof deck, and we're looking out over Baltimore. He's like, yeah, it's a great city. And I was like, yeah, kind of a whirlwind of a job interview. And he was like, yeah, do you think that that might be indicative of like how the job itself might be? I thought about it for a second. I was like, nah, probably a fluke. And just, I thought about that moment often afterwards, like, huh, that guy was really onto something.
Yeah, maybe we should listen to the friend of a friend a little bit more.
Yeah.
That's really funny. And so you got started with maybe the naive optimism and you kind of were just tackling one problem at a time. I don't know of a charter school administrator that isn't putting out fires or having 10 balls in the air all at the same time. What advice would you give to someone when they have more problems than they do time? How did you get through that?
Yeah, I'm gonna give the advice that sounds really cool coming from, a home office. And then I'm gonna talk about what implementing it actually looks like, right?
Cool.
So the advice that sounds cool and you can read in any book or hear at any TED Talk is like you've got to prioritize, right? And you just cannot solve everything at once. And so you've got to figure out like where is it that my time is going? Where is it that my time should be going? And how do I reconcile those worlds? Now that sounds cute. If you're not physically in a school with like emergency drills and irate families coming in and student issues all the time. And so what I tell folks is you've got to do a few things. First of all, really try to make a list of what you will not do, right? And especially when you're really overwhelmed, it can actually be easier to say yes to everything because it just gets added onto a pile that in the end we know we can't possibly do all of anyway.
It's almost like debt, maybe, where you're just like, yeah, it's another 50 bucks. I'm already 50,000 in debt. What? It's like, yeah, and it just keeps accumulating.
I think that's exactly the right analogy, right? So it's like if you are in a job that has like a little less chaos, which director of operations is not that job, no matter how systematized you are at it, right? It's always going to be a chaotic job. But if you're at a nice, like 9 to 5, 40 hours a week type of situation, whenever someone pushes something, you're like, ooh, that's going to put me at 42 hours a week. It's really easy to say, nope, just like with the debt thing, like, hey, I've got no debt. I don't want to take on any debt. I actually have to say no to this assignment. But when you're already working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, and you know you're not going to finish everything anyway, just add it to the pile. We'll see if it happens, right? And
Yeah.
so it's about like, I love that analogy, starting to get out of that debt by saying, hey, I know it would be really cool to have this family event, but right now we're completely focused on enrollment and recruiting. And this is not an event that meets that goal. Like we cannot commit to doing this and just slowly saying no to things. Um, and then once you've said no to enough things, it's about building some muscle on your team about what you say yes to. So in any school, if you have the time to prioritize, you can completely change a system, depending on what system it is, not like technology systems, but an in-school system like arrival, dismissal, that kind of thing, in 3 to 4 weeks, right? And setting your team up for little wins where we say, hey, we're going to keep X balls in the air. We're just going to do the minimum we can to like make sure these things all happen. Here's the list of things we're not doing. But in the next month, like we are going to nail arrival. It's been completely messy. We've had family incidents and issues happen. It's setting the tone for a really chaotic start to the school day. It's related to our breakfast, and we're not getting our NSLP reimbursements because we're not keeping track of which kids are coming in and grabbing breakfast. Like we are going to fix this situation in the next 3 to 4 weeks. It will empower your team so much to feel like they can actually focus their energies on one thing, prioritize, and nail it. And so if you can carve out the time, being able to name a team priority, hit that goal together and say, see what it looks like when we set a priority, we work towards it as a team, and we achieve a result. That's really powerful to be able to do as a leader.
That's awesome. Yeah, it reminds me of the pretty common quote of just like that humans, and maybe I'm getting it backwards, but we overestimate what we can do in a day and underestimate what we can do in a year,
Yep.
where we say like, oh, I'll do this, and then we don't get any of it done that day. But it's better to say like, I'm just gonna get this one thing done today. And if I can get one thing done every day, that's 5 things done. Or like if I can get one thing done this month, that's like a big priority. At the end of the year, that's 12 big things done. Um, so I love that.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. It's like, of course, as operations people, there's so many things we have to keep on life support, and that just is the role. But what can we do to try to say, you know, get this pile of things a little smaller, make priorities, and accomplish big things in the months and years ahead of us?
Yeah. So that I assume that you've probably become a master of saying no. What would you tell someone who's kind of a people pleaser like myself? how would you instruct someone on how to professionally, appropriately say no without sounding like, that grumpy old dude that doesn't want to take on any
Yeah,
new projects?
that's a great question. I was actually just chatting with one of my mentees about this. So whenever somebody brings me something that I know is likely not going to fit into my priorities for the next day, the next week, the next month, the next year, I typically won't frame it as just, no, I'm not doing this. I will come with my set of priorities and say, hey, over the next week, I think I'm going to be able to get these top 3 priorities done. And then this was my list of 3 things that, like, it'd be nice if it happened, but probably won't. And then here's my long list of things in the parking lot that just aren't going to happen this week. Now, if you want me to take on this new task this week, can you help me identify which of these 3 things in my must-do priorities should move down to the parking lot, right? And so I think that's really helpful because sometimes you as a member of a team might not have the full context. And so you might be getting an ask from a principal or somebody else, and it feels like, oh, this is not a priority. Let me just say no to it. And that's hard, but you can do it. But you may actually realize that the principal is bringing you something to say, oh, this is actually, sorry I didn't frame it this way, but it is critical for meeting our academic goals or our enrollment goals. And they can actually say, okay, that does need to be your first priority this week, but I understand that you have other priorities and we can move those to next week or next month. And so it provides us with that framework to say no, where your manager or someone you collaborate with is looking at that and they may actually say, whew, now that I see what you've actually got on your plate, yeah, you're right, this isn't something I should be adding to it. But it also gives space for people to say, hey, this truly is the top priority. You've got to do it, but I can work with you to make sure that we clear some space out so that you can focus on this.
That's awesome. I love that. Um, the next question that I have for you is, when you said that you kind of got on a train and you just went and visited some of the top schools, what were some things that you learned, and what advice do you have in general for shadowing and learning?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually have a template I use to sort of prepare for school visits. And so I'll have that available on my website, and I can send you the link to that as well. And so
Yeah, I
people are
love that.
totally welcome to use that. So I do, as much preparation as possible for my school visits in terms of thinking through, like, who do I want to talk to at the school? And if I can reach out ahead of time and say, hey, I'd really like to interview your office manager, like set up those, meetings and times if that's available. And then also think really specifically about what systems I'm looking at. So that's one thing. I take a million pictures. So I always ask ahead of time, like, hey, is there anything you don't want me to photograph? And usually it's like, hey, just make sure no kids are in the photographs. But I take pictures of, like, if there's tape on the floors that indicates how transitions are supposed to go, if there's clear signage in the main office about how people are supposed to sign in, or if there are, maintenance or facilities people and they, conduct certain reviews, when do they sign in? And then I also really make sure that I have, like, a sponsor on site who, I'm not just walking through the school, but someone is anchoring. And at the end of the day, I want to have a debrief with them so I can ask a million questions and be like, I notice that, you all have this, lunch/gym space, and you go through this crazy transition where just 10 minutes after a gym class is done, like, tables wheel in and everything gets perfect and the lunch line gets set up. Like, can you talk me through how long it took to get those logistics tight? Can you send me the emails and the logistics plans, et cetera, that you gave people to instruct them on their role in getting this kind of thing right? So that's sort of how I set up the school visits and think through how to make the most of them. And in terms of what I've learned over the course of the school visits, I would say a lot of what I've learned is that, like, as far as the operational leaders go, there's sort of like 3 levels. There's, like, things are in chaos, right? You walk into school and like, you ask the teachers and they're like, yeah, our operations leader, they're not quite cutting it. Like, they really can't make it happen for us. And that's a bummer, right? But it's obvious when that's happening. You're like, yeah, the operations isn't really making it happen. Then there's level 2, which I think is where most people get stuck, which is operations hero. And that's like, you ask the teachers, like, hey, how's operations going? And they can name the director of operations and they're like, this person is my hero. Like, I'm starting class and my projector isn't working and I text them and they're there in 2 minutes and they fix it. And, it's always like, we're just about to run out of paper, and they run to Staples and they get us extra reams of paper for the copiers. And like, this person is on it. They are the heart of the school. We couldn't function without them. And like,
Yeah.
it feels good to be that person because everyone's like, oh my gosh, like they're the best, right? But the real place you want to be as an operations leader is the place where you ask teachers in the school about operations, and they're like, oh, I don't know. I don't really think about the operations of this school. And then you dig deeper and you're like, oh, well, does your technology work? And they're just like, well, yeah, of course it works. Why wouldn't it work? It's like, oh, well, and do the printers work and the copiers? And is there always paper? And they're like, yeah, of course they do. Why wouldn't it?
Hmm.
And so you almost want to be invisible as an operations leader, would be like, and you have to go through every level to get there. But I think a lot of people stop at that hero level because they're like, I'm doing everything I can. Everyone recognizes that I am like key to this school functioning. And you want to get to the place where people don't even realize that there are schools where, oh, I guess maybe in some schools your technology wouldn't work all the time.
Yeah.
And you want to be able to just sort of like float above it all and manage the systems that make all the behind the scenes stuff invisible.
I love that. It reminds me of a quote from Atomic Habits over my shoulder, where it says, "You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems."
Yeah.
And so having those systems in place so that when you do take a vacation or you do need to get that herniated disc replaced, like the world doesn't crash.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that's
No, the
awesome.
the
And so,
number one DO I ever like shadowed, who's still my hero, I'd asked him, I said, well, you must be holding this place together. Like, if you disappeared, what would change? And he said, nothing. And like, he's like, yep, I keep it all, maybe after a year if no one replaced me, but if I disappeared for a day, a week, a month, we'd be fine.
that's awesome. I love that. That's so good. And so, um, you before we started recording, you mentioned a couple of resources. I would love to get a list of maybe books, websites, website template, or like page templates that you have, anything that would be useful to someone listening to this and wants to actually take action instead of just saying, "Oh, that was a good episode," and then just moving on with their day. How could they take some of some action with some resources?
Yeah. I mean, my number one recommended book for operations is the Checklist Manifesto. I do it in all my trainings. I think it is sort of the Bible for operational excellence. So hugely recommend that. In fact, I'll do you one better. I will sponsor it. If you have any listeners who are like, hey, I'm on a tight school budget, like I don't know that I can just, get a copy of this book. If you email me, honors@schoolops.com, School Ops will send you a copy of the Checklist Manifesto. Everyone deserves one. Um, so that's my number one book. And then I'm going to put some pressure on myself to finally get this out the door. But School Ops has a bunch of resources that are, templates, just like the school visit template that I mentioned. We have event planning templates and standard operating procedure templates, etc. And we've rolled these out in the trainings that we do for individual districts, schools, CMOs, states, etc. But we're getting all of those publicly available on our website. And so I don't know what the turnaround time is for publishing these interviews, but my hope is that by the time you click go on this, I will have all that stuff on the School Ops website, because my feeling is, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. We've all been there. Everyone should have access to high quality templates so that they can just like sleep one extra hour in their operations journey
Yeah.
instead of, staying up at midnight being like, I know somebody has, built a template for running a parent teacher conference, but I don't know where it is. So I'm just going to start from scratch myself.
Yeah, I love it. Fantastic. Yeah, we will have links to the checklist manifesto and to your website so that they can check out those templates. Some random questions that I have for you. And if you don't have an answer to all of them, that's okay. But what is your opinion on meetings?
Mm, yeah, it's a good question. I think that, gosh, and in schools it's different, right? Because you're all physically in this space. I think that in schools, what we end up with a lot of the time is a lot more impromptu meetings than we need and a lot less scheduled meetings than we need. And so I really believe in set a dedicated one-on-one time. If you're a director of operations with your principal, they're always checking in. set a dedicated one-on-one time with anyone that you manage, and as much as you can, hold that time sacred and create systems that allow that to happen, right? If you set a dedicated one-on-one time with the office manager and they're the person who answers the phones, but you have no system for someone else to answer the phones, you haven't actually committed to that meeting, right?
Mm.
Um, and at the same time, I would say, you know, be focused on priorities and when possible get pulled into less impromptu meetings, less of just, hey, could you pop into my office, my classroom, let's talk about something. You can say, hey, is it quick? If not, I've got a huge priority today, I've got to complete, but can I get on your calendar for tomorrow or something? But also recognizing that those meetings are inevitable. What I would have as a director of operations, I had like a flexi for my week and I had it on my laptop, and I would like walk around the whole building with my laptop like in the crook of my arm. Everyone thought I was going to drop it, but I did have like a hit list for
Mhm.
every person in the building. And so if I got pulled into an impromptu meeting with someone, I wasn't going to walk away from that meeting like, oh, I totally forgot to ask them. Like I could go
Mhm.
down and be like, okay, my hit list for you is 1, 2, 3. And so when we did get out of our scheduled meeting cadence and we got thrown into the chaos of impromptu, I made sure I made, the most of that time.
That's awesome. I've never thought of doing that. That's great. And you just have that in like your notes on your phone or something like that, or
Yeah, I basically had a Google Doc called a Flexi that I refreshed every week. So every week I would have like each day and what my priority was for that day, scheduled meetings I had and my agendas for those meetings. And then I would just take notes of like everything that happened through the day, like action items, pieces of information, etc. And then below, like each day, I just had that hit list of everyone I needed to talk to. And then at the end of the week on Fridays, I spent half an hour, sort of like creating a copy of it, creating a version for the new week, and just going through it to see were there any action items I didn't hit. If I had a hit list for people and I never saw them in an impromptu way, do I need to email them these items? Like, and just making sure that like going into the next week, I've processed all my information from the previous week, and sort of set myself up for success going forward.
yeah, I love that. And I like how you focused on sometimes the inefficiency of impromptu meetings because I had never really thought about that previously, but just a few months ago, I had a big question for one of my mentors. And I reached out in an email and I said, hey, can I get on your calendar? I'd love to be able to go over this big decision that I need to make with you. And he said, yeah, sure. And then right after he agreed to the meeting, I listened to a podcast where someone talked about that same situation where how to reach out to a mentor for advice. And they said, oftentimes you actually don't need the meeting. It's kind of a waste of time. You're wasting their time and your time. What you should do is write an email to the mentor saying, this is my problem. This is what I think I should do. What are your thoughts? And so, like, I think it should be this, this, this. And then don't send it. Reply to that email as if you were them. And then I replied to my question as if I was Bruce. And I said, yeah, like you shouldn't do this. Like, why would you ever, like, I wouldn't ever give that away. That's like a really important thing. I would maybe try these different options. And if it really is a good opportunity, these things would happen. And you don't have to stick your neck out so far. And then I replied back to him and said, actually, I don't need the meeting because I just replied to myself as if I was you. And I think I have my answer. Um,
Yeah.
and the impromptu meetings are sometimes just the stress of the moment. You just want to bring somebody else in, and it's not effective and it's not efficient by any means. So I love that.
Yeah, that's a great reflection. And yeah, we often have our own answers. And so, as a director of operations and now, as an entrepreneur who, I am my own big boss. And so I don't have anyone I can reach to above me and say, hey, this is my recommendation, but you can choose whatever you want to do. A really good habit for me was big decisions are big decisions, right? It's like you got to have a good process for them and ultimately you got to make them. But we face a million small decisions a day. And so one thing that was really good for my discipline was saying, hey, this is a small decision. It doesn't really matter that much, but we do have to make a call and it could become a big issue if I just let this linger and there's a lack of clarity and it never gets made and nothing ever happens. So what I would do is I'd say, look, it's a small decision. I don't need to solicit more information. I have all the information I need. I just need to make a call. And I would give myself a timer. I'd say like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and just say at the end of this, I have to decide. And I would free write. And I'd basically do exactly what you did, where I'd write out like, here are the pros and here are the cons, and here's what I think I would do. And then at the end, I would change to italics font. And the italics was essentially what you were saying, responding to myself and saying, okay, like my decision is, or I think what you should do is, and then timer would go off and I would just have to move forward. Because I do think we're so stressed in the operations world in schools that the decision fatigue is unbelievable. And sometimes just saying, I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to recognize this is not even in the top 5 decisions I need to make this week. And so the key is to make it and move on. It's not that it has to be the perfect decision. Let me set a time limit, frame the question, and answer it myself. I don't need to kick this to a Friday meeting with my principal.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great. I guess that would kind of fall in the category maybe of like failing fast and
Mm-hmm.
or or not being paralyzed with, the paradox of choice and picking a decision. And I think I've become more liberated as an entrepreneur myself and a business owner when I say I think this is the right choice. I'm going to go with it, but it's not the end of the road. It's not like I made this choice and I put it in the river and now it's in the flow of the river and I have no control over it. It's like I make this choice and then a consequence happens and then I can make another choice. I can either like apologize or I can explain why, or maybe it worked out really well and I could continue going that route. It's not like the end of the world. The decision isn't the end. Where it's like, oh, I hope it went well. It's like, no, you can continue to influence your decision. It's important just to keep moving though.
Yeah.
Um, so
And I will add for ops folks who are listening to this and they're like, well, I just can't imagine being in that situation because I don't feel like I have the autonomy to make decisions. That's also a very real problem that I see a lot of operations teams face, is feeling like every last little thing has to be approved by their principal or their executive director. And so this advice, I think is applicable if you feel like you've got a measure of autonomy. However, if you feel like, well, the culture of our school is, the principal has say over everything, then I think you can take some steps to start to create those one-on-ones with your principal and start moving from those one-on-ones being, here's the list of decisions I want to make. Are you okay with this? To, hey, let's explore a bucket of work. Let's pull apart, enrollment or facilities or nutrition or whatever. And can we talk about what are the things that I can make a decision and send you an FYI email about? Like, hey, just FYI, I signed a contract with our uniform vendor. Uniforms increased by 50 cents since last year. It's because of inflation. FYI, as opposed to having to take this to the meeting and being like, hey, it's the uniform vendor we've used for 5 years. The price is going up by 50 cents. Are you okay with that, principal? And slowly starting to get to a better collaborative space where you're able to carve out zones of autonomy, but also recognize the places where actually it's really critical that you come together before making a decision. And that way your meetings can become more productive, where you're really digging into the things that require collaboration and decision making. And you can autonomously take care of a huge checklist of things that really the principal just needs a, hey, FYI, this happened, not a, I need your thought partnership about this 50-cent price
yeah,
increase.
I I love that. I've never really thought about that, but the power of like an FYI.
Yeah, and we've got a tool for that as well that we can share with people in terms of like how to structure and agenda that out, and like create some real clarity around roles and responsibilities so you can achieve that.
That's awesome. Cool. Another question that popped up in my head is the idea of I'm not sure if you read the book Extreme Ownership by Jocko Wilking. I think it's Wilklink or something like that. But um, him and Leaf Babin talk about just the importance of like taking on ownership and not just saying like, oh, like it's their fault or it's this fault or they didn't do this. I feel like at schools that because there's so many roles and so many hats, it's easy to kind of go like, yeah, but it's not my fault. Um, how do you have any advice or insight into how to take ownership of like your role or anything along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I coach schools, I use a framework called the MOCA framework. And what it stands for is M is for manage, O is for own, C is for consult, H is for help, and A is for approve. And basically, with every bucket of work that has sort of operations being part of it, I force the team to go across and say, for the principal, the director of operations, the office manager, the special projects manager, the assistant principal, whoever's in the mix, who has which letter, right? And and you don't need every letter for every single bucket of work. Some ones don't have a consult or don't have a help or whatever, but every single bucket of work needs an owner. And what you recognize in doing this exercise is sometimes you run into issues because two people think they have ownership. And then you really need to talk it out and say, okay, it looks like the principal and the director of operations, both in their version of the MOCA chart, put O under uniforms. They both think they're the owner of uniforms. It can only have one owner. So maybe it's, if the principal really cares about this, that the operations person is the owner and they drive this forward, they make the contracts, etc. And the principal is A, they're an approver, right? But maybe it's, hey, the principal actually does not need to be part of this. And the operations director really is the owner, approver, everything. They just run with this. And so you uncover those problems where there are multiple owners, but you also uncover problems where there's no owner, right? Where it's like everyone just kind of working on it. And it's like, oh, well, I thought, as the operations person that the deans were in charge of, our dismissal procedures because, they kind of deal with like culture and discipline. And so I thought that was kind of their thing was they made sure that all the kids got, sent off. And the deans are like, oh no, I mean, we'll handle culture and discipline stuff, but I thought you were sending off the logistics of like, how we do bus dismissal and how we make sure kids get picked up. And then you realize, okay, well, there's been a miscommunication here, but there needs to be an owner here. And so let's have a, team conversation about who makes sense to be the owner.
I love that. Cool. Um, I'm really glad that I asked that question. I wasn't sure if I was gonna get an answer for it, because it's kind of out of left field, but man, you came out slugging.
Love some
Um,
ownership.
the last question that I have written down on my notes is, do you have like a takeaway where it's just like, Dallin, this takes 5 minutes to implement and it will help them so much. Like there's a lot of hard things that take weeks and you have to make it a priority and work as a team. Is there anything where someone who is listening to this can just take it and go like, man, that took all of a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes to implement, and I'm so glad that I did
Yeah,
it.
that's a
Do you
great
have something like
question.
that?
Yeah. There is a extension that you can attach to your Gmail called Boomerang. I think if you're a
Okay.
nonprofit, it costs like $10 a month or something. And what Boomerang does is when you send an email, you can check a little box that says, if you haven't yet replied to me by X date or in X amount of days, please return this email to the top of my inbox. And so as an ops director, you are constantly haranguing like vendors and facilities and maintenance people and all kinds of folks, right?
Hmm.
And so instead of having to keep in my head, like, oh, I asked the maintenance person to, come on site and fix this thing. And then if I forget about it 2 weeks later, I'm digging up the email like, oh my gosh, they never responded to me. I would use Boomerang just to say, hey, if they don't respond to me in 2 days, send this. And I have, the receipts now of like 7 different times, every single day I'm emailing this person, hey, just circling back. Hey, just checking in. Hey, just wanted to know if you've seen this, right? And it basically puts my ability to be really, really annoying on steroids, right? And like takes it out of my mental space. So instead of keeping a list of the 50 emails I need to send, it's just popping back and I'm just circling in and it's 5 seconds of my time. So I highly recommend that Chrome extension. It costs a little bit of money, but it saved me so many like conversations over email that could have just dropped off. And then I didn't realize until it became an emergency again that I never got a response, and bring them to the forefront. So I'm just constantly nudging people who aren't getting back to me.
Cool. I love that. Um, Thank you for sharing that. Um, well, Anders, this is pretty much all that I have. Do you have any other thoughts, insights, stories, resources that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
No, I mean, you did a great job of pulling it all out of me. So thanks so much for the time. And the last thing is just, for anyone who's listening, feel free to reach out to me. Obviously, as School Ops, my organization, we do trainings, we provide resources, all of these things. But at the same time, right, I'm just about making sure that schools have what they need to have excellent operations. So for anyone who's like, oh, I'm not ready to do a project with School Ops or have a contract or anything like that, like, I'm happy just to be a thought partner, the person you bounce something off of and you say, hey, like, I just need a, 30-minute call with someone to talk through, like, I can't get to the bottom of this operational thing. And I can just say, hey, here's a template, this will help. Or, hey, I know someone who solved that problem a year ago. Let me connect you with them. And so don't hesitate to reach out. Anyone who's listening to this, like, I've been in that ops silo. It can be very lonely. You are welcome always to pick my brain and have my ear, and I've been there, and I want to make sure that I'm there for you because it's the hardest work.
So I love that. Yeah, go to schoolops.com. We'll include the link to the website and Anders' email in the show notes so you can check that out. Yeah, I've been highly uplifted by what you've shared. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for your time as well. This has been great.
Yeah, catch you later.
All right, have a good one, Dallin.